Well, here we are again, late 2024, and Kenya's already seen some pretty big political shakeups.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua, being impeached
Huge.
feels like a massive political event, right? But, when you start digging a little deeper, what becomes clear is that this isn't just some one-off thing.
Right.
It's more like the latest chapter in a long and often turbulent story
Oh, yeah.
of Kenyan presidents and their number
Yeah.
twos hitting these very public bumps in the road.
Yeah, bumps or maybe even like full-on collisions sometimes.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
at a head-on.
Yeah, head-on collision.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah. I'm really excited to get into this one. I mean, the dynamics between presidents and their deputies in Kenya, it's a fascinating topic. There's so much history there.
Yeah, there's a lot of history, and we've got a lot of really great material to to wade through and unpack.
Yeah, we do.
We've got news analyses. We've got a great breakdown of the impeachment itself from a YouTube video, and then just some general background information on the Deputy President's office, just to set the stage.
Yeah, definitely. I think understanding the role itself is crucial to getting a grasp of why these relationships can be so volatile.
Exactly. And our goal, I think, is to really understand the why behind this recurring instability.
Yeah. Why does this keep happening? I mean, is it personality clashes? Is it something structural? Is it just the nature of Kenyan politics? These are some of the questions we're going to try to explore.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this right from the beginning
Yeah.
is that you know how the mechanisms of power have evolved?
Oh, yeah.
Because before 2010, a president could just remove their deputy, full stop.
It was like, you're out.
You're out.
I don't need you anymore.
Exactly.
Yo, home.
But then this new constitution introduced impeachment via the legislature.
Yeah.
So Gachagua's situation, this is the first time this particular method of removal has been used on a sitting deputy president.
Yeah, it's unprecedented. It really sets a precedent, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the future.
It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the history of this, right? Let's go right back to the beginning.
Let's do it.
The first instance of a major fallout.
Okay.
President Jomo Kenyatta and his VP, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga.
Classic.
What can you tell us about their initial dynamic there?
Well, they were instrumental, obviously, in leading Kenya to independence in 1964. Kenyatta as the head of state and Odinga as his principal deputy.
Right.
But even though, they were working together very closely during the struggle for independence,
Right.
Their visions for Kenya's future direction, especially on the global stage, started to diverge pretty sharply, pretty quickly.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. What were those visions?
Well, Odinga, he was much more in favor of forging stronger alliances with communist nations, like China and the Soviet Union.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he saw them as, potential allies in this new kind of post-colonial era.
Right.
These were countries that had also sort of thrown off the shackles of imperialism and, had gone in a very different direction,
Right.
the West.
Right.
So he saw a lot of potential there in terms of, economic cooperation, political support,
Right.
kind of, pushing back against Western dominance.
Right. Yeah.
Kenyatta, on the other hand, he preferred closer ties with the U.S. and the Western powers.
Oh, so very different.
Very different, yeah.
So right away, we see a core kind of insight, right? That
Okay.
these big ideological differences,
Yeah, exactly.
even at the highest levels of government,
At the very top.
can fracture these seemingly strong political partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show that, even when you have this shared history of struggle, there's no guarantee that those partnerships will last.
Totally. Especially when you have these fundamental differences in how you see the world and where you want your country to go.
Yeah, so a fundamental disagreement on which way a newly independent Kenya should orient itself internationally.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
That sounds like it would create some pretty significant friction
Oh, absolutely.
at the top. What were the consequences of this divergence?
Well, it definitely led to, increasing tensions, within the government, within the ruling party,
Yeah.
ANU.
Uh-huh.
And ultimately, those differences became totally irreconcilable.
Okay.
So in 1966, Odinga resigned from his vice presidential position,
Wow.
and he left KNU.
Okay.
And then he went on to establish the opposition party, the Kenya People's Union, or KPU.
It's KPN.
KPU.
Yeah.
And this was a huge moment in Kenya's early political history
Oh, really?
because it marked the emergence of a formal opposition.
Okay, so up to that point, there really wasn't much of a
Not really.
formal. I mean, there was dissent and there were different factions within KNU, but there wasn't like a clearly defined opposition party
Okay.
that was, challenging the government in parliament and in elections.
Got it. Got it. So Odinga kind of ushers in
Yeah, he's really a pivotal figure in that sense.
this new era.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so from there we move into the long tenure of President Daniel Arap Moi.
Okay.
And it looks like he also experienced his fair share of deputies who didn't last the course.
Yeah, she went through a few.
Yeah. So first up was why Kibaki? What's the story there?
Yeah, so Moi appointed Kibaki as his VP in 1978, following Kenyatta's death.
Okay.
And initially, their working relationship seemed pretty stable.
Okay.
But as time went on, strains started to develop.
Okay.
And before his eventual dismissal, Kibaki, who, had held some pretty influential ministerial roles like finance,
Right. Right.
he was moved to less prominent position.
Oh, interesting. So they kind of shuffled him around.
Yeah, shuffled him sideways a little bit.
Okay.
And, one of Kibaki's longtime associates, he claimed that Moi felt that his own authority might be challenged by Kibaki's, economic expertise and his extensive connections within the international community. So the idea was that Kibaki's growing influence was perceived as a potential threat.
I see.
It's like, he was getting a little too big for his britches.
Powerful, yeah.
Yeah.
So another instance where a president may have felt strategically weakened by his deputy.
Yeah, and I think this is a theme we're going to see again and again, right? This sense of the deputy accumulating too much power.
Right.
And the president feeling threatened by that.
Yeah, like a zero-sum game kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so Kibaki shuffled off,
Mhm.
and Kibaki wasn't the only one, right? So next was Dr. Josephat Karanja,
Oh, yeah.
and his time as VP was remarkably brief.
Yeah, Karanja's tenure was short-lived, to say the least.
Yeah.
I mean, he succeeded Kibaki, but his time in office lasted only a year and 37 days.
Wow.
Yeah, he resigned in 1989 to avoid a parliamentary vote of no confidence.
Wow, what led to that?
Well, there were some pretty serious accusations against him.
Like what?
Well, including allegations of plotting to overthrow Moi's government with foreign support.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a big one.
that's a big one.
There was also a widespread perception that Karanja was, too proud,
Really?
which apparently didn't sit well within the, the very tightly controlled political establishment of the Moi era.
Right, so kind of stepping out of line a little bit,
Yeah, he wasn't playing the game.
and that was not tolerated.
Not tolerated.
Okay, so what's striking about this is just the speed of his rise and his equally rapid fall from grace.
Yeah, it really is remarkable.
Because he only became an assistant minister in 1986 after winning a by-election.
Right.
And then boom, he's VP just 2 years later.
Yeah, he rose through the ranks very quickly.
And then out the door.
And then out the door even faster.
A meteoric ascent followed by a dramatic crash.
Yeah, a real roller coaster.
It really highlights how quickly those political fortunes can shift.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in Kenyan politics, you can be up one day and down the next.
Totally.
It's a very unpredictable landscape.
Okay, so then came George Saitoti, who actually served as VP for a significant period across 2 different stints.
Right.
That suggests a more stable relationship, at least for a time.
Yeah. Well, Saitoti actually holds the record for being Kenya's longest-serving vice president.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he held the position from May 1989 to January 1998,
Okay.
and then again from April 1999 to August 2002.
Okay, so almost a decade.
Yeah, close to a decade in total.
Wow, okay.
But even his tenure wasn't without its, complexities.
Yeah.
I mean, after the 1997 elections, Moi delayed reappointing him for a full 14 months.
Wow, what was going on there?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it definitely hints at some underlying tensions or strategic consideration.
Right.
I mean, maybe Moi was trying to send a message, or maybe he was testing Saitoti's loyalty. Who knows? But ultimately, their relationship fractured in September 2002 when Saitoti publicly opposed Moi's decision to endorse Uhuru Kenyatta as his successor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so Saitoti, he harbored his own presidential ambitions,
Right.
and Moi's choice effectively sidelined him.
Right.
So even the longest-serving deputy, eventually found himself at odds with the president when his own political aspirations kind of clashed with the president's succession plans.
Yeah, and that's an interesting theme too, right? Like we're seeing these VPs who, they're in this position of power, they're working closely with the president, but ultimately, they have their own ambitions.
Of course.
And those ambitions sometimes clash with the president, and that's where we see these problems arise.
Yeah, it's this constant tension between loyalty and ambition.
Right.
How do you serve the president while also positioning yourself for higher office?
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
a delicate balancing act,
Totally.
and it often goes wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like, we see that over and over again.
Yeah, it's a recurring pattern.
Yeah. Okay, so moving into the Kibaki presidency.
Okay.
It seems like he also had a few different deputies.
Yeah, Kibaki's time in office did see some turnover in that role.
Okay.
His first VP, Michael Kajana Wamalwa, tragically passed away shortly after taking office.
Oh, right.
Which is just a sad reminder of the human element in all of this.
Yeah, right.
These are people with families and lives and ambitions, and sometimes those things get cut short.
Right, right.
So after Wamalwa's death, Moody Awori took over.
Okay.
But he lost his parliamentary seat in the 2007 elections.
Right,
Which obviously meant he could no longer serve as VP.
right.
So even a change in parliamentary standing, as we see with Awori, could abruptly end a deputy presidency.
It's a very precarious position, it sounds like.
Yeah, very precarious.
Wow.
And then finally, Kalonzo Musyoka became vice president in 2008 during that very tense period of post-election violence.
Right.
And he served until 2013. And, Musyoka's appointment during a crisis like that really underscores how, political expediency and the need for stability can also really shape these partnerships.
Right, like you need someone to kind of come in and steady the ship.
Exactly. You need someone you can rely on in a crisis.
Right.
Someone who can help you navigate these very choppy waters.
Okay, so that brings us to probably the most famous recent example.
Yeah.
This seemingly unshakable Uhuru-Ruto partnership between President Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto.
The dynamic duo.
Yeah, they even had those matching outfits in the early days.
Oh, yeah. The power suits.
So what exactly went wrong there?
Well, initially, their alliance after the 2013 election was really strong.
Right.
I mean, it was symbolized by those coordinated outfits, the Uhuru shorthand. It was a real brand.
Right, right.
And they were a formidable coalition. They overcame some serious challenges, including that joint indictment at the ICC.
Right.
But the dynamic shifted really dramatically after that contested 2017 re-election.
Okay, so that was the turning point.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the end, you could say.
And what happened there?
Well, Kenyatta's decision to reach out to his longtime political rival, Raila Odinga, in the now famous handshake of March 2018,
Right.
without Ruto's involvement or endorsement,
Right.
that proved to be like the major turning point.
Okay.
The Uhuru-Ruto fallout. And I mean, it feels like a particularly violent rupture in this ongoing political saga.
Yeah, it does feel that way.
Like a real betrayal almost.
Yeah, almost.
Like a stab in the back.
So the handshake, I mean, it was intended to promote national unity. Right?
Yeah, that was the stated goal.
But it seemed to really drive this deep wedge between Kenyatta and his deputy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Ruto viewed the rapprochement with Odinga with a lot of suspicion.
Right.
He believed it was a strategic maneuver to undermine his own presidential ambitions for 2022.
Right.
Kenyatta's bringing his rival in close. It looks like he's trying to sideline Ruto.
Right.
And so as Kenyatta and Odinga's relationship kind of blossomed, Ruto increasingly distanced himself. He started openly campaigning to succeed Kenyatta, much to the president's displeasure, and the animosity became very public. I mean, at the Madaraka Day celebrations in June 2022, Kenyatta notably failed to even acknowledge Ruto during his address.
Wow.
And then, of course, in the 2022 elections, Kenyatta actively endorsed Odinga over his own deputy,
Right.
further underscoring the complete breakdown of their relationship.
Wow. Yeah, it's kind of amazing when you think about it that way.
Yeah, it was like a complete divorce.
It's like a political divorce.
Yeah, and a very messy one at that.
Yeah.
I mean, people were describing it as like a broken political marriage
Right.
with Odinga as the third partner.
Right.
And there was even this idea of like an unwritten 20-year prenuptial agreement.
Oh, really?
Like Kenyatta serving 2 terms and then backing Ruto for 2.
Oh, wow.
And that just completely dissolved.
Yeah, wow.
So it was a really dramatic and acrimonious split.
Okay, so looking back across this whole, this history of Kenyan presidents and their deputies, what are some of the fundamental reasons why these relationships seem so susceptible to failure?
Well, I think there are a few key factors at play.
Right.
Firstly, deputies are often selected for very practical, strategic considerations.
What do you mean?
Well, like the resources they bring to a campaign,
Right.
the strength of their regional support,
Right.
specific technical expertise, rather than, a deep personal bond or a really shared ideological framework with the president.
I see.
So it's more about what they bring to the table politically,
Right.
rather than, a genuine meeting of the minds.
Right.
And so this kind of transactional basis, it can become unstable as the political landscape evolves.
Right.
Because what might have been a valuable asset at one point in time could become a liability later on.
Right, totally.
And secondly, a deputy who was once seen as a valuable asset can, over time, be perceived as a liability or even a direct threat to the president's authority, especially as they start to cultivate their own networks and ambitions.
Right.
They start building their own power base.
Yeah.
And the president starts to see them as a potential rival.
Right.
And, the very position of deputy president, it offers this platform for building alliances and accumulating influence,
Right.
which can understandably lead to suspicion from the president,
Yeah, for sure.
who might see this as potential plotting or a future challenge to their leadership.
Right. So it's almost like a catch-22 for the DP.
Exactly.
Like you're in this position of power, but the very act of using that power to build your own networks and advance your own ambitions
Right.
can be seen as a threat to the president.
Yeah. And, you're always walking this tightrope.
Right.
You have to be loyal to the president, but you also have to be thinking about your own future.
Right.
And it's very easy to fall off that tightrope.
Yeah. And it seems like, based on this history, a lot of them have.
Yeah, the track record's not great.
Not great. Okay, so thinking about Gachagua's selection in 2022,
Okay.
what factors were at play there?
Well, he brought some significant things to the table for Ruto.
Like what?
Well, he had significant financial resources.
Okay.
Strong mobilization capabilities.
Okay.
And crucially, he had the support from the politically vital central Kenya region.
Right.
So he ticked a lot of boxes for Ruto in terms of what he needed to win the election.
Right.
But once in office, it seems that his populist statements and reputation for ethnic bias,
Right.
as various sources pointed out,
Right.
those seem to have become a political liability for Ruto.
Interesting. Okay, so those very things that made him a strong candidate
Exactly.
ended up sort of being his undoing.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic in a way.
Yeah, for sure.
But it just goes to show that the political landscape can change very quickly.
Right.
And what might be an asset in one context can become a liability in another.
Right.
And I think that's what we saw with Gachagua.
Okay, so that leads us to the recent impeachment of Rigathi Gachagua.
Okay.
Can you just walk us through the key events in that process?
Sure. So the impeachment process unfolded pretty quickly.
Okay.
On October 8th, 2024, the National Assembly voted in favor of impeachment.
Okay.
And then the matter moved to the Senate, which also voted to impeach Gachagua on October 17th.
Okay.
And it's important to note that Gachagua was actually absent from the Senate proceedings.
Why was that?
He was reportedly hospitalized.
Okay, so he wasn't even there to defend himself.
No, he wasn't.
Wow.
And the grounds for impeachment were pretty serious.
What were they?
Well, there were allegations of corruption,
Okay.
insubordination towards the president,
Right.
and engaging in ethnically divisive political rhetoric.
Ah.
So there were even accusations that he was acting as a sort of co-president,
Oh, wow.
thereby undermining President Ruto's authority.
So stepping on Ruto's toes a little bit.
Yeah, big time.
Okay. And insubordination, it seems like that was a particularly significant point.
Yeah, it definitely played a role.
And the U2 analysis that we watched,
Right.
they highlighted some instances where Gachagua had publicly criticized the National Intelligence Service.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one.
Which could be interpreted as a direct challenge to the president's leadership.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's like you're not just, disagreeing with policy or, you're directly challenging the president's,
Authority.
his authority and his institutions.
Yeah, exactly.
And there were also these, more serious allegations.
Yeah, it wasn't just about rhetoric. There were claims that Gachagua had financially supported those anti-tax protests that happened in June 2024,
Right.
which, further fueled this perception of disloyalty.
Right. So really kind of like working against the president.
Yeah, it looked that way.
Okay, so throughout this entire process, President Ruto maintained a very conspicuous silence.
Yeah, he was very quiet.
which a lot of observers interpreted as tacit approval of these impeachment efforts.
Right. It's like he was letting it happen.
Right, right.
He wasn't standing in the way.
And then in November 2024, Kithure Kindiki was appointed as the new deputy president.
Right. A new era begins.
And Kindiki was actually considered a strong contender for the DP position back in 2022, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was seen as a front runner back then.
Okay, so why didn't he get it?
Well, it's hard to say for sure.
Right.
But there were rumors that maybe Ruto felt he was too independent-minded.
Oh, interesting.
Or maybe he didn't want to have two Kikuyus at the top.
Right.
To balance out the ticket a bit.
Right.
But whatever the reason, Kindiki was ultimately passed over in favor of Gachagua.
Right, right.
And, he has a long history with Ruto.
What's his background?
Well, he's a lawyer by training.
Okay.
He served as a senator.
Uh-huh.
He was deputy speaker of the Senate.
Okay.
And most recently, he was the cabinet secretary in the Interior Ministry.
Okay, so he's got a lot of experience.
Yeah, he's a seasoned politician.
Right.
And, he's known for being a very sharp legal mind.
Okay.
And a very loyal ally to Ruto.
Okay, so do you think this is going to be a more stable partnership?
Well, it's hard to say. It's still early days.
Right.
But on paper, they seem like a good fit.
Right.
They have a shared history. They have similar ideologies.
Right.
And Kindiki is seen as someone who's not afraid to speak his mind,
Okay.
but also someone who's ultimately loyal to Ruto.
Right. So he can give him that honest feedback.
Yeah.
But also, not go rogue.
Right. He's not going to go off and do his own thing.
Okay. Well, we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, we'll have to watch this space.
But I think it's also worth noting the political strategy behind choosing Kindiki to replace Gachagua.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because he also hails from that politically influential Mount Kenya region,
Right.
ensuring the continuation of regional representation in the top leadership.
Yeah, that was definitely a key consideration for Ruto.
Right.
He needed to maintain that support from Central Kenya.
Right.
And appointing Kindiki was a way to do that.
Okay, so then what was the role of Raila Odinga in all of this?
Oh, well, Odinga's newfound alliance with President Ruto was a crucial factor in Gachagua's removal.
Okay.
His members of parliament and senators largely supported the impeachment,
Right.
which, really illustrates just how fluid Kenyan politics can be.
Right. These alliances shift so quickly.
Oh, yeah, it's a constantly evolving landscape.
Yeah, totally.
And, the National Assembly even selected a close associate of Odinga to head their legal team during the impeachment proceedings.
Wow.
So, yeah, Odinga's fingerprints were all over this impeachment.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Okay, so Gachagua has initiated a legal challenge to the impeachment.
He has, yeah.
But the outcome remains uncertain,
It does.
as does the potential for his future political comeback.
Yeah, it's really too early to tell what the future holds for Gachagua.
Right.
He's a very resilient politician.
Right.
He's got a strong base of support.
Uh-huh.
So, I wouldn't count him out just yet.
Right, right.
But he's definitely facing an uphill battle.
Okay, so I think, just to kind of bring this all together,
Yeah.
Gachagua's impeachment, rather than being an isolated incident,
Right.
it really does fit into this long and intricate history
Yeah, it's part of a pattern.
of presidents and their deputies
Yeah.
experiencing these significant fallouts.
Absolutely.
And the shift from, a simple presidential dismissal to a legislative impeachment under the 2010 Constitution,
Right.
that represents a significant change in how these power dynamics actually play out.
Yeah, it's a new era.
Yeah, and it really makes you think,
It does.
considering this recurring pattern and the often strategic rather than deeply personal selection of deputies,
Right.
what does this persistent instability in the deputy presidency truly reveal about the nature of political alliances and power dynamics within Kenya?
Yeah, it's a really profound question.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes you wonder about the very nature of power in Kenya.
Right.
Is it always going to be this zero-sum game
Right.
where one person's gain is another person's loss?
Right.
Or is there a way to build more collaborative and less transactional relationships?
Yeah, and that's a question that, we can't answer today.
No, it's a question for the ages.
Yeah, but it's definitely something worth pondering.
Yeah, definitely.
Could Gachagua's impeachment and the swift appointment of Kindiki mark a new direction? Or is this cycle just destined to repeat itself?
Yeah, is this a turning point or just more the same?
Right, and it really gives you a lot to consider regarding Kenya's political stability and its future leadership.
Yeah, I mean, this whole saga really raises some fundamental questions about the future of Kenyan
Right.
politics. And I think it's a conversation that we need to keep having.
Totally. And I think it's a conversation that our listeners can continue as well.
Absolutely. I mean, this is something that affects all Kenyans,
Right.
and it's important for everyone to be engaged in this debate about the future of our democracy.
Absolutely. Well said.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it really has. And we want to thank you for listening, and we hope that you'll continue to join us as we explore more of these complex and intriguing topics.
See you next time.
See you next time.